Imagine being on a flight, sitting quietly when suddenly you're forced to confront a powerful flight attendant, and it all escalates from there. What happens when one man stands his ground against an entire system? The tension is real, and the stakes are high. You won't believe what happens next. Keep watching to find out. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Elias Mercer adjusted his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. The airport lounge was busy, a constant hum of conversations, mixing with the occasional crackling announcement over the intercom. He shifted in his seat, stretching his long legs beneath the table, feeling the stiffness settle in. Business trips weren't new to him, but this one carried a different weight. This wasn't just about closing a deal or giving another pitch. This was about his name, his legacy. He reached for his phone, scanning the messages from his wife, Amira. "Have a safe flight. The boys are excited to see what you bring back this time. Love you." Elias smiled, rubbing the back of his neck. He typed a quick reply, reassuring her he'd call before takeoff. The flight from New York to Los Angeles would be a long one, and he wasn't looking forward to it. He checked his boarding pass, business class, a rare upgrade thanks to his firm wanting to show appreciation for his work. Not that it made much difference. A few extra inches of legroom wouldn't change the fact that his mind was already racing ahead to the meeting waiting for him in LA. Avalon Heights. The name alone carried weight in the world of architecture, a project that promised to redefine urban sustainability. Elias had spent years developing his expertise in green infrastructure, designing structures that didn't just fit into the environment, but worked with it. Yet despite his credentials, despite everything he had achieved, he knew what people saw first: a black architect, not the man who had revolutionized water reclamation systems in high-rise buildings, not the engineer behind award-winning sustainable designs. No, before anything else, they saw his skin, and they questioned. Elias sighed, rolling his shoulders, as he heard the first boarding call for his flight. Time to go. The queue moved quickly. He handed his ticket to the gate agent, who barely glanced at him before waving him through. As he stepped onto the plane, the cool blast of cabin air hit him, and he inhaled deeply. The familiar scent of leather seats, recycled air, and faint traces of coffee filled his senses. He walked toward his seat, passing rows of passengers settling in. Some were already on their laptops, others scrolling mindlessly through their phones. Business travelers like him, stuck in the routine of flights and meetings, living in between time zones. Sliding into his seat, he placed his carry-on beneath the space in front of him, adjusting the overhead air vent. A flight attendant, a blonde woman with a crisp uniform and a practiced smile, moved through the cabin greeting passengers. When she reached Elias, her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, so brief that most wouldn't have noticed. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said, her tone neutral. Elias nodded, offering a polite smile. He had seen that hesitation before. The brief flicker of uncertainty, the silent questioning of whether he belonged in this section. He let it roll off his shoulders, just like he always did. The boarding process continued, and Elias took out his tablet, pulling up the notes for his presentation. As he scrolled, his focus was interrupted by raised voices from the front of the cabin. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your tickets are for economy class. This is the business section." A woman stood near the divider between classes, arguing with the flight attendant. She was dressed in designer clothes, her posture rigid with frustration. Beside her stood a young boy, no older than 7 or 8, gripping the strap of his oversized backpack. His hair was neatly combed, but his small frame trembled slightly, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. "There must be a mistake," the woman insisted, her voice sharp. "My father would never book us in economy. Check again." The flight attendant, the same one who had greeted Elias, maintained a stiff smile. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but these are the seats assigned to your tickets. Please proceed so we can complete boarding." Elias watched as the woman's face tightened. Then, as if remembering something, she straightened. "My father is Theodore Greaves," she stated, the name hanging in the air like a challenge. A few heads turned at the mention. Elias recognized it instantly. Greaves was a real estate mogul, a man whose company shaped skylines. The very man Elias was set to meet in Los Angeles. The flight attendant didn't budge. I'm very sorry, but the seating assignments are final. With a frustrated huff, the woman grabbed her son's hand and stormed past Elias toward the economy section. The boy stumbled slightly, his backpack nearly knocking into Elias's arm. Sorry, sir, the child muttered, eyes wide with embarrassment. Elias shook his head with a small smile. No harm done, buddy. The boy gave a faint nod before following his mother, disappearing into the back of the plane. Elias exhaled, his fingers tapping against his tablet. Something about the boy's expression stuck with him. That quiet discomfort, the way he held himself so small. He thought of his own sons, how easily a child could pick up on tension, even when they didn't understand its full meaning. The flight continued boarding, and soon the overhead chime signaled the cabin doors were closing. Elias adjusted his seatbelt, leaning back as the captain's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing their estimated flight time. He turned to his window, watching as the runway lights blurred into streaks of gold against the darkening sky. Another flight, another city, another meeting to prove himself in a world that never seemed to stop questioning. As the engines roared to life and the plane lifted into the sky, Elias closed his eyes, already anticipating the turbulence ahead. Not just in the air, but in everything waiting for him on the ground. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and the cabin hummed with quiet activity. Flight attendants moved down the aisles, handing out menus and preparing for service. Elias reached for the extra blanket tucked beneath his seat, already feeling the familiar chill of the high-altitude air. He let his gaze drift across the cabin, absent-mindedly scanning the faces of his fellow passengers. Most were already absorbed in their devices, noise-canceling headphones cocooning them in their own private worlds. A man in the row ahead of him had reclined his seat the moment they hit cruising altitude, oblivious to the irritated sigh of the woman behind him. Across the aisle, a middle-aged couple whispered in hushed tones, their fingers intertwined over the armrest. Elias shifted his attention back to his tablet, scrolling through his notes. The meeting with Theodore Greaves was set for the day after tomorrow, and the stakes were high. If Avalon Heights became the sustainable marvel he envisioned, it wouldn't just be a win for him, it would be a win for the entire field of green architecture. But as much as he wanted to focus, his mind kept wandering back to the boy from earlier. A slight commotion drew his attention to the back of the business class section. The flight attendant, Rhea, according to her name tag, was making her way down the aisle with a controlled, professional air. Elias followed her gaze and found himself looking at the woman from earlier. The one who had name-dropped Theodore Greaves. Vivian Greaves. She had returned to the front of the cabin, her arms crossed, her expression tight with frustration. I just want to check again, she said, her voice lower now but still edged with impatience. I don't understand how this mistake happened. Rhea smiled, but there was an unmistakable stiffness in her demeanor. I completely understand, ma'am. Unfortunately, we can't make any changes at this point. Vivian exhaled sharply, glancing past the attendant. Her gaze flickered over Elias for a split second before moving on, as if she had barely registered his presence. Elias had seen that look before, the kind that slid past him, dismissive in its casual certainty. He wasn't important enough to acknowledge. Rhea cleared her throat lightly. Would you like anything to drink while you're here? Vivian hesitated before shaking her head. No, I'm fine. She turned and walked back toward economy, her posture stiff, her heels clicking against the carpeted aisle. Elias leaned back in his seat, suppressing a smirk. It was a strange thing, watching someone so accustomed to privilege be told no. His amusement, however, was short-lived. Not even 5 minutes later, the temperature in the cabin dropped slightly as the air conditioning kicked in. A soft rustling sound reached his ears, and he glanced toward the back. The boy, Julian, if he had heard correctly, was curled up in his seat, hugging his arms close to his chest. His mother, still typing furiously on her phone, barely acknowledged him. Elias hesitated, then sighed. Standing, he grabbed the extra blanket from his seat and made his way toward the economy section. Vivian barely looked up as he approached, her brows furrowed in concentration, but Julian did. His blue eyes widened slightly as Elias stopped beside their row. Here, Elias said, holding out the folded blanket. You look like you could use this. The boy's face lit up, his fingers reaching out eagerly. Thank you, mister. Before he could take it, Vivian's hand darted out, catching his wrist lightly. "Peter, be careful with that," she murmured. "You don't know where it's been." The words were quiet, barely above a whisper, but Elias heard them. A muscle tightened in his jaw. Julian hesitated, his fingers curling slightly as he glanced between his mother and Elias. For a moment, Elias considered saying something, challenging that subtle, unspoken implication. But then he exhaled, forcing his expression into something neutral. "It's clean," he said simply, "and warm." Julian's small fingers closed around the fabric, tugging it toward him. He flashed Elias a grateful smile before wrapping it around himself, his small frame visibly relaxing. Elias nodded once and turned to leave. As he walked back to his seat, he could feel the weight of Vivian's gaze on his back. It wasn't the kind of stare that burned with anger or open hostility. No, this was something quieter, something uncertain. He had seen that look before too. The moment when someone was forced to confront their own biases and didn't quite know what to do with them. Settling back into his seat, Elias reached for his tablet again. But this time, it was harder to focus. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the cold edge in Vivian's voice. Maybe it was the way Julian had looked at him, like he was the first person to really see him in that moment. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because he knew this flight was only the beginning. Elias stared at his tablet, but the words blurred together. His mind wasn't in the presentation anymore. It was still replaying that brief exchange with Vivian Greaves. The way she had reached for her son's wrist, the careful choice of words that implied something more than concern. He had been here before. Different faces, different settings, but the same unspoken hesitation. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his thumb against the edge of his tablet. It wasn't worth dwelling on. People like Vivian weren't new to him, and he had learned long ago that you couldn't force someone to see their own biases. They had to come to that realization themselves, if they ever did at all. The hum of the plane was steady now, passengers settling into the rhythm of the flight. A few had already reclined their seats, closing their eyes, while others quietly scrolled through their phones. The occasional clink of glasses and hushed conversation from the flight attendants filled the silence. Elias took a sip of water, trying to shake off the lingering frustration, when a small voice caught his attention. "Hi again." He looked up. Julian stood beside his seat, clutching the blanket Elias had given him. His hair was slightly mussed now, and his socks peeked out from under the hem of his pants. His mother wasn't with him this time. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Shouldn't you be sleeping?" The boy shrugged. "I'm not tired." A smile tugged at the corner of Elias's mouth. "That's so?" Julian nodded. "I wanted to say thank you again." Elias set his tablet aside. "You already thanked me, kid. No need to do it twice." Julian hesitated, then glanced down at the fabric in his hands. "Mom says I shouldn't talk to strangers," he admitted. "But you don't seem like a stranger. You seem nice." Elias chuckled. "Well, I guess that makes me an exception." The boy's gaze flickered past Elias's seat toward the window. "I like looking out at the sky when we fly," he said. "It feels like we're floating in space." Elias leaned back, following Julian's line of sight. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, the faint glow of the moon casting a silver sheen over the clouds below. "You ever been on a plane before?" Elias asked. Julian nodded enthusiastically. "Lots of times. Grandpa has his own plane. He takes me flying sometimes." Elias raised an eyebrow. "That right?" "Yep," Julian said, grinning. "He knows everything about planes, and buildings too. He says buildings are like big puzzles, and if you don't put the pieces together right, they won't stand up." Elias let out a quiet laugh. "Your grandpa's not wrong about that." Julian rocked on his heels. "Are you good at puzzles?" Elias considered the question for a moment. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I am." Julian's face lit up. "Me too." The sound of footsteps approaching made Julian turn. A flight attendant, not Rhea this time, but a younger woman with dark brown hair tied into a neat bun, stopped beside them. "Hey there, buddy," she said, crouching slightly to meet Julian's gaze. "Shouldn't you be in your seat?" Julian glanced up at Elias before looking back at the flight attendant. "I was just talking to him." The woman smiled gently. "I'm sure you were, but we're flying pretty high up and it's important to stay safe in your seat, okay?" Julian sighed but nodded. Okay. The flight attendant looked at Elias, her expression soft. Sorry about that, she said quietly. Kids get restless on long flights. Elias shook his head. No problem at all. As Julian turned to leave, he paused. You never told me your name, he said. Elias smiled. It's Elias. Julian repeated the name under his breath, as if committing it to memory. Then, without another word, he padded back toward the economy section, dragging the blanket behind him. The flight attendant straightened. That was sweet of you, she said. Not everyone would have been so patient. Elias shrugged. Kid was cold, she smiled. Well, I hope you get some rest, Mr. Mercer. He nodded, watching as she moved down the aisle. Turning back to the window, Elias let out a quiet sigh. This flight was turning out to be far more eventful than he had expected. Elias watched Julian disappear back into the economy section, his small frame vanishing into the rows of passengers wrapped in blankets and dim cabin lighting. The hum of the engines filled the space around him, a low and steady vibration that had always been oddly comforting. He leaned back, rolling his shoulders, willing himself to settle. But something about the brief exchange with Julian lingered. It wasn't the boy himself. Kids were naturally curious. It was the way he had looked at Elias with an openness that adults rarely had. No hesitation, no judgment. Just a simple interaction, unclouded by the weight of expectation. A stark contrast to his mother, Vivian Greaves. Even the name carried weight, the kind of name that unlocked doors, commanded respect, and shaped city skylines. She had barely looked at Elias when they had crossed paths earlier, but when she had spoken, when she had muttered that single comment about the blanket, he had felt it, that quiet, instinctive withdrawal. He had encountered it before, the subtle barrier that people like Vivian carried, often without realizing it. The hesitation, the careful distance, the coded caution in their words. Not outright hostility. That would have been easier. Instead, it was something softer, more insidious. A thread woven into the fabric of everyday interactions, so ingrained that most didn't even recognize they were holding it. Elias exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He wasn't going to waste time dissecting the actions of a woman he'd never see again after this flight. His focus needed to be on Avalon Heights. He turned his attention back to his tablet, skimming through the structural reports for the project. The numbers were solid, the sustainability models promising. If executed correctly, Avalon Heights could be one of the most energy-efficient developments in Los Angeles, maybe even in the country. But that was a big if. Theodore Greaves was known for prioritizing profitability over innovation. Elias had seen developers like him before, men who loved the idea of sustainability as a marketing tool, but balked at the costs of actually implementing it. That was the fight waiting for him in Los Angeles. As he scrolled, the quiet clinking of glassware pulled his attention back to the aisle. The flight attendant, Rhea, was making her rounds, refilling drinks, her movements brisk but polished. When she reached Elias's row, she barely spared him a glance. "Anything for you, sir?" she asked, her tone professional but cool. "Just water," Elias said, keeping his expression neutral. She nodded, pouring a glass with mechanical efficiency before turning to the next passenger. Elias wasn't surprised. He had picked up on her demeanor from the start. The hesitation when she had greeted him earlier, the way she had handled Vivian's seating complaint with a forced smile, but had barely made eye contact with Elias when he boarded. It wasn't obvious, but it was there, and he was used to it. He took a slow sip of his water, letting the cold liquid chase away the tightness in his throat. He told himself to let it go, just like he always did. But then, just as Rhea reached the next row, he heard her voice shift. "Oh, I'm so sorry about that, sir. Let me get you a fresh one." Elias glanced up. The man in the seat ahead of him, a middle-aged businessman with salt and pepper hair, had barely spoken. But Rhea was already moving to replace his drink, her smile warmer, her body language subtly more accommodating. Elias felt his jaw tighten. It was small, barely noticeable. But he noticed. And as the flight attendant moved on, chatting lightly with another passenger, Elias let out a slow breath. He wasn't imagining it. It was always the same script, just a different stage. He shifted in his seat, rolling his shoulders again. He refused to let something this minor get under his skin. This was nothing new. Instead, he turned his focus back to his work, grounding himself in numbers and blueprints, in things that made sense. Let them think whatever they wanted. He had bigger things to prove. Elias adjusted his seat, trying to settle into a comfortable position. The hum of the engines had become a steady backdrop, a rhythm he was used to on these long-haul flights. But despite the quiet atmosphere, he couldn't shake the irritation curling in his chest. He wasn't the type to dwell on slights. It was exhausting, picking apart every interaction, every micro-expression, every shift in tone. But some things were too familiar to ignore. The way Ria's demeanor had changed depending on who she was speaking to. The way Vivian Greaves had so easily dismissed him. It was the kind of thing that didn't need to be said out loud to be understood. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before reaching for his tablet again. But just as he tapped the screen, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Vivian was back. This time she wasn't lingering near business class. She was walking straight toward him. He sat up slightly, watching as she approached. She stopped at the row beside his, hesitating for just a moment before speaking. She started, then exhaled sharply. Can I sit? Elias blinked. That wasn't what he had expected. Be my guest, he said evenly, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. She lowered herself into the seat, her posture stiff. For a moment she said nothing, just staring at her hands as if trying to collect her thoughts. Then finally she spoke. My son likes you, she said abruptly. Elias raised an eyebrow. Julian's a good kid. Vivian nodded, still not looking at him. He's curious about people. He doesn't think before he speaks, just says whatever's on his mind. She exhaled, finally lifting her gaze to meet his. Which is why I wanted to apologize for earlier. Elias studied her for a moment, trying to gauge how much of this was genuine. She hesitated, then continued. What I said about the blanket, it wasn't... She stopped herself, shaking her head. It wasn't meant the way it sounded. Elias let out a quiet laugh, though there wasn't much humor in it. It sounded exactly the way you meant it. Vivian stiffened slightly, but she didn't argue. Instead, she looked down again, fingers twisting the ring on her right hand. My father, she said after a long pause, always taught me to be careful about everything. About people, Elias tilted his head. And I'm supposed to believe that means everyone, not just certain kinds of people? She flinched, just barely, but it was there. Elias sighed, shifting in his seat. He wasn't interested in making her feel bad. He wasn't here to be her lesson in self-awareness. Look, he said, his tone measured. I get it. I do. People don't even realize the things they carry until it slips out. He shrugged. But that's not really my problem. That's yours. Vivian sat quietly, absorbing his words. Elias glanced past her, toward the economy section where Julian was now curled up against the window, fast asleep under the blanket he had given him. Your son, Elias said, nodding toward him, doesn't have that hesitation yet. He just sees people as people. But he's watching you. He's learning from you. Vivian followed his gaze. For the first time, her expression softened. I know, she murmured. A beat of silence passed between them. Then finally Vivian straightened. I wanted to say it out loud, that I was wrong. Elias studied her for a moment before nodding. Okay. She seemed to take that as enough. Without another word, she stood and made her way back to her seat. Elias exhaled, leaning back again. It wasn't much, but it was something. Elias hadn't planned on thinking about Vivian Greaves any longer than necessary. The moment she had walked away, he had told himself to let it go. But her words lingered. I was wrong. It wasn't an earth-shattering revelation. It wasn't some grand confession that would change the way the world worked. But people like Vivian didn't often admit they were wrong. And yet Elias knew better than to expect that a single moment of self-awareness would change anything long-term. He had seen it before. People apologized, then went back to their lives, returning to the comfort of what was familiar. He closed his tablet, deciding it was useless trying to focus on work. The soft glow of the cabin lights made the space feel smaller, more intimate. Most passengers had settled into sleep or quiet routines, but a few conversations still hummed in the background. A sudden, low murmur caught his attention. A few rows ahead, a man was speaking to Ria in hushed tones. At first, Elias didn't think much of it, just another passenger making a request. But then he caught a glance at Ria's expression. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her body was stiff, her arms crossed just slightly in a way that seemed more defensive than professional. Elias frowned. Something was off. The man leaned in closer. Rhea took a half step back. And then, "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat." Her voice was sharp now, her attempt at politeness slipping. The man, mid-50s, wearing a suit that had probably cost more than Elias's monthly mortgage, smirked. "Relax, sweetheart," he said, his voice oozing condescension. "I was just asking if you had any—" "You're making me uncomfortable," Rhea cut in, her tone suddenly clipped. Elias sat up straighter. He had seen interactions like this before, and they never ended well. The businessman scoffed, throwing his hands up. "Oh, come on, now I can't even ask a question without you getting all dramatic." Elias felt his irritation spike. And then, before he could think better of it, he spoke. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You heard her. Back off." The man's head snapped toward Elias, surprise flickering across his face before it morphed into something colder. "And who the hell are you?" he sneered. Elias didn't react, didn't flinch. "Someone who knows when no means no," he said simply. The businessman let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, give me a break. This is what's wrong with the world now. Can't even have a conversation without someone getting their feelings hurt." Elias held his gaze. "She didn't say she was hurt. She said you made her uncomfortable. And instead of respecting that, you doubled down." Rhea cleared her throat, regaining her composure. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat immediately, or I'll have to escalate this." The businessman's lips pressed into a thin line. He seemed to consider pushing further, his ego clearly bruised. But after a long moment, he exhaled sharply through his nose and muttered something under his breath before retreating to his seat. Rhea let out a quiet breath, straightening her uniform. "Thank you," she murmured, just loud enough for Elias to hear. He nodded, then leaned back in his seat, his heart still thrumming slightly. He hadn't planned on intervening. But when you saw something like that, you didn't just sit there. At least he didn't. And as the cabin returned to its quiet hum, Elias closed his eyes, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. This flight wasn't even over yet, and somehow it already felt like it had lasted a lifetime. Elias hadn't planned on making himself visible, not in this way. But the moment he had spoken up for Rhea, he had felt the shift in the air. The businessman might have backed down, but the damage had been done. Elias had drawn a line, and he knew exactly how that played out in spaces like this. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes, trying to will away the tension still lingering in his chest. It didn't last long. A few minutes later, footsteps approached his row. When he opened his eyes, Rhea was standing there. Her posture was stiff, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "can I speak with you for a moment?" Elias studied her for a beat. He had expected some kind of acknowledgement. A simple, "Thanks for stepping in," would have been enough. But something about her tone told him that wasn't what this was. He sighed, unbuckling his seatbelt before following her toward the galley at the front of the cabin. It was quieter here, the sounds of the flight muted by the narrow space. Rhea turned to face him, her hands clasped in front of her. "I appreciate what you did back there," she started, her voice still low, measured. "But I need to ask you not to get involved like that again." Elias frowned. "I was just making sure he backed off." "I understand," Rhea said quickly, "and I do appreciate it. But these situations can escalate fast, and I need to handle them in a way that doesn't create unnecessary conflict." Elias let out a slow breath. He had heard this before. "Unnecessary conflict," he repeated, his voice flat. Rhea hesitated. "Look," she continued, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. "That man. He's a frequent flyer, a VIP. If he complains about you, it won't go well. I'm just trying to—" "Protect yourself," Elias finished for her. She winced. "Rhea," Elias said, his tone quiet but firm, "I didn't step in to cause trouble. I stepped in because you looked like you needed it." For the first time, her mask cracked slightly. "I did," she admitted, "but that doesn't change how things work." Elias exhaled through his nose. He had been right. This wasn't about gratitude. It was about damage control. "Did he complain about me?" Elias asked, already knowing the answer. Rhea hesitated just a beat too long. He spoke to the purser, she admitted, said you made him feel uncomfortable, that you were interfering. Ilias let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Of course, a man made a woman uncomfortable, and when someone called him out on it, he was the one who suddenly felt like a victim. It was textbook. So, what happens now? Elias asked. Rhea shifted on her feet. Nothing, if we don't make it into a bigger issue. Elias studied her. He wasn't angry with her, not really. He understood what she was trying to do. She had probably worked hard to get to where she was, and she knew exactly how fragile her position was. But that didn't make it any less frustrating. Right, Elias murmured. Wouldn't want to make it a bigger issue. Rhea exhaled softly. I just need you to sit tight for the rest of the flight. No more. Attention? Elias nodded slowly. Got it. He turned to head back to his seat, but before he could step away, Rhea spoke again. For what it's worth, she said, her voice quieter now. You were right. And I do appreciate it. Elias didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at her, at the way she held herself, the way her shoulders were just a little too stiff. He thought about how often people like her, people like him, had to pick their battles, had to choose between what was right and what was survivable. And then he gave her a small nod before walking back to his seat. When he sat down, he felt the weight of the businessman's gaze a few rows ahead. He didn't acknowledge it. Let him look. Elias had said what needed to be said, and as far as he was concerned, that was the only thing that mattered. Elias sat motionless, staring at the back of the seat in front of him, his fingers drumming lightly against his knee. The plane's cabin felt heavier now, as if the air had thickened after his conversation with Rhea. He was used to this, the quiet fallout of speaking up. He wasn't naive. He knew how this worked. A businessman like that, someone who had likely skated through life with doors opening before he even had to knock, would never see himself as the problem. No, to men like him, Elias was the problem, the one who had stepped out of line. Elias shifted his gaze slightly, catching a glimpse of the man from the corner of his eye. He wasn't looking at Elias directly, but his posture was rigid, his jaw set tight. He would probably stew about this for the rest of the flight, convincing himself that he was the wrong party in all this. Elias exhaled sharply through his nose and turned back to his tablet, determined to refocus. But he didn't get the chance. A shadow appeared beside his seat. Vivian Greaves. Again. Elias glanced up, his expression unreadable. Something I can help you with? Vivian hesitated. Unlike earlier, she didn't seem as guarded. If anything, she looked uneasy. I saw what happened, she said, keeping her voice low. Elias raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. Vivian shifted, glancing toward where the businessman sat. I also saw him talking to one of the crew members after, she added. It looked serious. Elias let out a slow breath. Yeah, well, that tends to happen when you bruise someone's ego. Vivian hesitated again, as if weighing her words. You know he's not going to let it go, right? Elias finally looked at her fully. You're really coming over here to tell me that? Vivian exhaled. She stopped, pressing her lips together. You're meeting with my father in Los Angeles, aren't you? Elias stiffened slightly. There it was. You know about that? He asked evenly. Vivian nodded. I overheard you talking to Julian earlier. You mentioned architecture, and I know my father's next meeting is about Avalon Heights. Elias studied her. And why does that matter to you? Vivian hesitated before answering. Because my father listens to people like him more than people like you. She nodded slightly toward the businessman. Elias wasn't surprised. He had already suspected as much. Theodore Greaves had a reputation. He surrounded himself with familiar faces, with men who shared his worldview, men who saw people like Elias as assets, useful, but never equals. Vivian sighed. Look, I don't know what kind of reception you're expecting when you meet with my father, but I can tell you right now, it's not going to be fair. Elias let out a quiet laugh. Fairness isn't really something I expect in my field. Vivian flinched at that, but she didn't argue. Instead, she straightened. Just be careful, she said, her voice quieter now. These men, They don't like being challenged. Elias met her gaze, holding it for a long moment. Finally, he gave a small nod. Vivian didn't say anything else. She just exhaled softly before turning and making her way back to her seat. Elias leaned back, staring at the ceiling of the cabin, his mind already working through the implications of what she had just said. The businessman wasn't the problem. He was just a symptom of a much larger disease, and Elias had a feeling that Theodore Greaves was about to remind him exactly how deep the sickness ran. The cabin had settled into quiet. Most of the passengers were either asleep or absorbed in their own worlds. The hum of the engines was steady, a constant backdrop to Elias's thoughts. But he wasn't at ease. Vivian's warning replayed in his mind. These men? They don't like being challenged. He had known that already. He had lived it. But something about the way she had said it, about the way she had looked at him, left an uneasy feeling in his chest. And that feeling only deepened when he saw the flight attendant walking toward him. Not Rhea, a different one. Male, mid-40s, with a neatly pressed uniform and a face that was all practiced neutrality. The purser, the highest-ranking crew member in the cabin. Elias had been waiting for this. "Mr. Mercer," the purser greeted, stopping at his row. His voice was smooth, professional. "Would you mind stepping to the front of the cabin with me for a moment?" Elias sighed inwardly. Here we go. He unbuckled his seatbelt, standing up without argument. Sure. The purser led him to the galley, where they had more privacy. The space was tight, dimly lit, filled with the faint scent of coffee and stored meals. The man turned to face him, clasping his hands together in front of him. "I wanted to have a quick word regarding an incident earlier," he began. Elias nodded, keeping his face neutral. The businessman. The purser didn't confirm, but he didn't deny it either. "There was a concern raised about a tense interaction," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "We want to ensure all passengers feel comfortable throughout the flight." Elias almost laughed at that. "Do you?" he asked, his tone light but edged with something sharper. The purser hesitated, caught off guard by the directness. Elias crossed his arms. "Let me guess. He told you I was aggressive? That I interfered when I wasn't needed?" The purser kept his expression neutral. He expressed discomfort with how the situation unfolded. Elias let out a slow breath, nodding. "Right. And did he mention why he made the flight attendant uncomfortable in the first place?" The purser hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough. This wasn't about fairness. It never was. Ellis had been seen. He had been noticed. And that was the real problem. "What exactly is it you're asking me to do?" Elias finally asked. The purser straightened. "We're simply asking that you refrain from further involvement in any passenger disputes." Elias let out a soft chuckle. "Right, because the real issue isn't what happened. It's that I spoke up about it." The purser's expression didn't change. "I can assure you, sir, we are only concerned with maintaining a peaceful flight for everyone." Elias held his gaze for a beat longer, then exhaled, shaking his head. He could fight this. He had every right to, but he knew exactly how it would end. It always ended the same way. A man like that, he would get to sit comfortably for the rest of the flight, knowing that he had been listened to. And Elias, he was being told, not so subtly, to disappear. He wasn't new to this game. He just hated how predictable it was. Elias nodded once, forcing a polite smile. "No problem. I'll keep to myself." The purser relaxed slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer. Enjoy the rest of your flight." Elias turned, walking back toward his seat. As he passed through the aisle, he felt the businessman's eyes on him, a small, smug flicker of satisfaction. Elias didn't acknowledge it. He sat down, exhaled, and stared at the window. The sky outside was dark, endless. The flight would land in a few hours. And then he'd walk into a boardroom filled with men just like that businessman, and he'd make them listen, whether they liked it or not. Elias sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the window, but his thoughts weren't on the clouds stretching endlessly below. He had been here before, not on this exact flight, not in this exact seat, but in this exact moment, the moment after someone had quietly reminded him of his place. The purser had used the word discomfort like a weapon, wielding it with the precision of someone who had done this before. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't accused Elias of anything outright. He had just suggested that Elias be more careful, be more mindful. It was always the same message, wrapped in different packaging, and Elias was tired of unwrapping it. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling slowly, grounding himself in the steady hum of the engines. He knew better than to let this get to him. He had bigger fights ahead. But just as he forced himself to refocus, movement in the aisle caught his attention. Vivian was back. Again. Ilias barely reacted this time. He simply glanced at her, arching an eyebrow as if to say, "What now?" Vivian hesitated before speaking. "I saw what happened," she murmured, glancing toward where the purser had disappeared. "I saw him pull you aside." Elias didn't respond at first. He wasn't sure if she expected a conversation or if she was just speaking to fill the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured. "And," Vivian shifted on her feet, "and I just thought you should know that men like my father, they operate the same way." Elias turned to face her fully now. His interest piqued despite himself. "What do you mean?" Vivian sighed, crossing her arms. "They don't yell. They don't make a scene. They just move pieces behind the scenes, make quiet calls, pull quiet strings. And by the time you realize what's happening, the damage is already done." Elias studied her, trying to gauge where this sudden shift was coming from. "What do you want from me, Vivian?" She hesitated. Then after a long pause, she spoke. "I want you to be prepared." Elias let out a soft laugh. "I'm always prepared." Vivian shook her head. "No, you don't get it. You think you're prepared because you've dealt with men like him before. But my father? He doesn't just dismiss people. He erases them." Elias stiffened slightly. "And you're warning me because—" Vivian exhaled. "Because I don't know if he's going to see you as an asset or a threat. And if it's the latter, he won't argue with you. He won't try to prove you wrong. He'll just make sure you're not in the conversation at all." Elias held her gaze. There was something unsettling about the way she said it. Not if he tried to erase Elias. "When?" Vivian hesitated for a second longer, then straightened. "Just be careful," she muttered before turning and walking back toward the economy section. Elias sat there staring after her, his mind already working through the implications of what she had just said. The flight would land soon. And then the real fight would begin. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the final descent into Los Angeles. Around the cabin, passengers stirred, stretching stiff limbs, adjusting seatbelts, preparing to re-enter their real lives. Elias sat still, his mind anywhere but on the landing. Vivian's warning echoed in his head. He doesn't just dismiss people, he erases them. He had known this meeting with Theodore Greaves wasn't going to be easy, but erasure, that was a different kind of threat. Greaves had the power to shut doors before Elias even reached them. A single conversation, a quiet decision, and suddenly Elias's name could be removed from the Avalon Heights project altogether. Not denied, not debated, just gone. And now, thanks to the manufactured incident on this flight, Elias had the sinking feeling that Greaves already had his excuse lined up. The businessman, the one who had felt uncomfortable, wasn't just some random passenger. He was someone with influence, someone who could make a well-placed complaint, tarnish Elias's reputation before he even stepped foot into that boardroom. Elias rolled his shoulders, exhaling slowly. Fine, let them try. He had spent his entire career proving himself to people like Greaves. This meeting? It was just another battlefield. The plane jolted slightly as it descended through the cloud cover, shaking some of the drowsier passengers awake. The businessman 2 rows ahead shifted in his seat, glancing back once, as if to check if Elias was still there. Elias caught the look. He smiled, a slow, deliberate expression, not of amusement, but of recognition. The businessman's jaw tightened, and he turned back around. Elias shook his head. Coward. As the plane leveled out for the final approach, Rhea passed by his row. She didn't stop, didn't make eye contact. But Elias noticed the slight hesitation in her step, as if she wanted to say something. He let her keep walking. She had made her position clear earlier, and he had bigger problems to deal with. The landing gear deployed with a mechanical thud, and the plane touched down smoothly, rolling down the runway as the engines roared in reverse. The city of Los Angeles stretched beyond the terminal windows, golden light spilling over its endless grid of streets and high-rises. Elias exhaled, bracing himself. The moment the seatbelt sign flicked off, the businessman stood, grabbing his bag with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. Elias stayed seated, waiting, watching. Vivian walked past his row, her gaze briefly meeting his. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had done her part. The rest was up to him. Elias reached for his bag, standing slowly as passengers shuffled into the aisles. It was time to see just how far Theodore Greaves was willing to go. The airport terminal buzzed with movement, the rhythmic roll of suitcase wheels blending with overlapping voices and boarding announcements. Elias moved through the crowd with steady purpose, his carry-on slung over one shoulder. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. Your meeting at Greaves Corp is confirmed for 10 a.m. car service, waiting outside Terminal 4. Elias glanced at the time. 7:45 a.m. He had a little over 2 hours before walking into what was shaping up to be one of the most important meetings of his career, and one of the most dangerous. As he exited the terminal, the crisp Los Angeles morning greeted him. The city was already alive, horns blaring, conversations spilling onto the sidewalks, the smell of fresh coffee mixing with car exhaust. Near the curb, a sleek black sedan idled, its tinted windows reflecting the rising sun. The driver, a middle-aged man in a sharp gray suit, stepped forward the moment he spotted Elias. "Mr. Mercer?" Elias nodded. "That's me." The driver opened the rear door. "Mr. Greaves has requested I take you to the office personally." Elias climbed in without a word. As the car pulled away from the curb, he allowed himself a brief moment to prepare. He had studied Greaves from afar, seen his work, analyzed his projects. But this was different. This wasn't just about Avalon Heights. This was about whether Elias Mercer would be allowed into the room at all. Inside Greaves Corporation. By the time the car pulled into the private entrance of the Greaves Corp headquarters, Elias had sharpened his mind into a blade. The building itself was a monument to wealth, a towering structure of glass and steel designed to impress and intimidate. It wasn't the kind of architecture Elias admired. It didn't blend with the environment. It stood over it. The driver escorted him through a private lobby, where a receptionist greeted him with a polite but distant smile. "Mr. Mercer, Mr. Greaves will see you shortly. Please wait in the executive lounge." Elias nodded and took a seat in a leather chair near the window. The room was immaculate. Polished wood floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and it was empty, a power move. Make him wait. Make him feel small before the meeting even begins. Elias sighed, crossing his arms. Amateur tactics. A few minutes passed before the door opened. A man in his early 60s walked in, dressed in a tailored navy suit, silver hair, sharp blue eyes, a presence that carried weight without needing volume. Theodore Greaves. Elias stood, meeting his gaze directly as the older man extended a hand. "Mr. Mercer." Elias shook his hand. Firm, controlled. "Mr. Greaves." The older man gestured toward the private meeting room. "Let's talk." The opening move. The meeting room was sleek, minimalist. A long conference table stretched between them, a single folder placed neatly at Greaves's end. Elias didn't miss the subtle positioning. This was Greaves's domain. The older man sat, steepling his fingers as he studied Elias. "You've been making quite the name for yourself," Greaves said, his tone measured. "Sustainability, green infrastructure, a fresh perspective." Elias leaned back slightly, mirroring his composure. "That's the goal." Greaves nodded slowly, then flipped open the folder. Elias caught a glimpse of the papers inside, his credentials, his projects, his career history, and something else, a printout of his flight record. Elias felt the shift immediately. South. That's how this was going to go. Greaves glanced up, feigning casual curiosity. "Tell me, Mr. Mercer, how was your flight?" Elias exhaled, keeping his expression neutral. The real game had just begun. Elias held Greaves's gaze, his heartbeat steady despite the obvious maneuver. So they were going to play this game. "How was my flight?" Elias repeated, tilting his head slightly. He allowed himself a small, slow smile. Uneventful. Greaves nodded, as if weighing the answer. Good to hear. He tapped a finger against the folder, the subtle rhythm filling the silence. I understand there was a bit of an incident. Elias didn't blink. If you're referring to a passenger making a scene with a flight attendant, then yes, I suppose there was. Greaves's lips twitched slightly. That's not the version I heard. Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. And I'm guessing your version came from a particular passenger? Greaves didn't confirm or deny. He didn't have to. Elias had spent enough time in boardrooms to recognize a test when he saw one. This wasn't about the flight. This was about control. Greaves wanted to see if Elias would defend himself, if he would get flustered, if he would do the one thing that men like Greaves always expected from men like him: apologize. Instead, Elias smiled. Well, I'm sure everyone has their own perspective, he said smoothly. But at the end of the day, I don't think an in-flight misunderstanding has much to do with Avalon Heights, does it? Greaves tilted his head, considering. A moment passed. Then just like that, he moved on. Of course not, he agreed. Let's talk about the project. Elias exhaled quietly. Round 1. Survived. The real negotiation begins. Greaves leaned back, fingers drumming against the table. I've gone over your plans, impressive work. But there's one issue. Elias gestured for him to continue. I'm listening. The cost. Of course. The budget for Avalon Heights has been set, Greaves continued. Investors are expecting a certain return. Your designs, while ambitious, push the limits of that budget. Elias had been expecting this. I understand the numbers, he said, keeping his tone level, but I also understand what's at stake. Avalon Heights isn't just another high-rise. If we do this right, it sets a new standard, not just for sustainability, but for how cities are built. Greaves studied him. And if we scale back? Elias shook his head. Then you'll have another glass and steel development that no one will remember in 10 years. Greaves chuckled. That's a bold claim. Elias met his gaze. It's the truth. The room went quiet for a moment. Then Greaves exhaled. You remind me of myself, you know. Elias didn't react. He had heard this line before. It was something powerful men said when they wanted you to think you were winning. Greaves tapped the folder again. I built this company because I understood how to navigate realities. Investors don't care about idealism. They care about results. Elias nodded. Then give them results worth caring about. A slow smile spread across Greaves's face. Not amusement, appreciation. Elias knew he had his attention now, but attention wasn't the same as approval, and he wasn't done yet. The pushback Greaves folded his hands. So tell me, Mr. Mercer, what's your compromise? Elias took a slow breath. I won't compromise on the vision, he said, but I can show you how to make it work without inflating costs. Greaves arched an eyebrow. And you're confident in that? Elias leaned forward. Try me. A pause, then Greaves nodded. All right, show me. Elias reached into his bag, pulling out his own folder. He had come prepared. And now? Now it was time to prove why he belonged in this room. Elias laid the folder on the table, flipping it open with deliberate ease. Greaves didn't move immediately. He simply watched, evaluating, calculating. Elias knew exactly what this was. Another test. Greaves had already seen his original designs. If he wanted to shut them down, he could have done it over email. But instead, he had called this meeting, brought Elias into the room. Why? Because men like Theodore Greaves didn't just reject ideas. They wanted to see how much you were willing to bend first. Elias wasn't here to bend. He slid the folder forward, tapping the first page. This is the adjusted cost breakdown. If you eliminate the unnecessary redundancies in your supply chain and negotiate directly with vendors instead of subcontracting, you reduce material costs by 14%. That covers the budget gap without cutting the sustainability model. Greaves finally reached for the folder, flipping through the pages with practiced efficiency. He didn't speak, but Elias could see the subtle shifts in his expression, the flicker of intrigue, the faintest narrowing of his eyes at a number he hadn't expected. Elias kept going. The energy system integration is what's scaring off your investors, he continued. They think it's an expense instead of a revenue stream. But if you leverage city tax incentives and structure the solar grid as a private energy resale model, the building generates its own operational costs, Greaves finished, his tone almost amused. Elias nodded. Exactly. Greaves sat back. For a moment he said nothing. Then he exhaled. You've done your homework. Elias allowed himself a small smirk. That's why you called me here, isn't it? Greaves chuckled. Fair enough. He closed the folder, steepling his fingers. Your model works on paper. But in reality, there are politics. Investors don't like risk. Elias didn't blink. And I don't like mediocrity. Greaves's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room did. A beat passed. Then Greaves leaned forward. I could replace you, you know. Elias didn't flinch. You could, but it won't change the numbers. Greaves studied him. The silence stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then, a slow approving nod. You're good, Greaves admitted. Elias relaxed just slightly. But, Greaves added, you're not untouchable. Elias's jaw tightened. There it was. The warning. The reminder. Men like Greaves never just handed you power. They made sure you knew who it belonged to first. Elias exhaled, keeping his voice steady. I'm not asking to be untouchable. I'm asking for results. Greaves's lips twitched. And if I back you on this? Elias met his gaze unwavering. Then you'll have a project that won't just make headlines. It'll set the standard for the next 20 years. Another pause. Then finally, Greaves smiled. All right, Mercer, he said, standing. Let's see if you're as good as you think you are. He extended a hand. Elias shook it, firm, controlled. The deal wasn't done yet, but he was still in the room. And that was the first real victory. Elias walked out of the boardroom with his head high, his pace measured, his face unreadable. He had won, for now. The deal wasn't signed yet, but the moment Theodore Greaves had shaken his hand, Elias had known. This was happening. And yet, there was no real relief. Because Greaves hadn't agreed out of admiration. He had agreed out of calculation. Elias had seen it in his eyes. This wasn't a partnership. This was an experiment. Greaves wanted to know just how far Elias could push before breaking. And if he did break, then Greaves would replace him without hesitation. Elias had spent his whole career preparing for moments like this, but that didn't make them any less exhausting. He exhaled slowly, stepping into the sleek private lobby of Greaves Corp, adjusting the strap of his bag as he moved toward the exit. The tinted glass doors slid open with a quiet hum, revealing the bright Los Angeles skyline beyond. Then, a voice behind him. Mr. Mercer. He stopped, turned. Vivian. She stood near the receptionist's desk, her expression unreadable, hands clasped in front of her. Elias arched an eyebrow. Didn't take you for the type to wait around. Vivian's lips pressed together, but she didn't take the bait. My father likes you, she said instead. Elias let out a short laugh. No, he doesn't. He just thinks I'm useful. Vivian tilted her head. Same thing in his world. Elias studied her. Why are you telling me this? Vivian hesitated. Then for the first time since they met, she looked uncertain. She started, then sighed. I don't know. Maybe I wanted to see if you'd actually walk out of that meeting with a deal. Elias smirked. And? Vivian's gaze flickered, something unreadable passing through it. Just be careful, she murmured. My father doesn't lose. Elias met her eyes, his voice steady. Neither do I. A pause. Then finally Vivian exhaled, nodding slightly before turning and walking back toward the elevators. Elias watched her go, then turned back toward the exit. The sun was high now, casting sharp shadows against the pavement. He stepped out into the city. The first battle was over, but the war had just begun. Elias stepped onto the bustling Los Angeles sidewalk, the weight of the morning still settling in his chest. The deal with Greaves wasn't secured, but it was set in motion. And that meant one thing. He had made himself a target. He had stood his ground, refused to bend, refused to be erased. And men like Theodore Greaves didn't forget that. They watched. They tested. And when the time came, they decided whether you were an asset to be used or a threat to be removed. Elias had been here before. This was nothing new, but this time it was bigger. The stakes were higher. He knew what came next. The subtle resistance, the quiet roadblocks, the sudden, unexplained delays, and maybe eventually a move he couldn't see coming. Elias exhaled, loosening his tie as he flagged a cab. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You got further than I expected. Let's see how long you last." No name. No signature. Elias stared at the screen for a beat. Then he smiled. Not out of amusement. Out of recognition. This wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. To fight. The cab pulled up, and Elias slid inside, already thinking 3 steps ahead. He had no intention of just lasting. He was here to win, and when it was over, they would remember his name. In the end, the story of Elias and Rhea isn't just about a confrontation between 2 individuals. It's a reminder of the power of standing up for what's right, even when faced with injustice and authority. Through Elias's calm resolve in the heat of the moment, we see that sometimes silence and composure can be the greatest strength. Would you be willing to stand up for what you believe in when faced with pressure? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on more inspiring stories and valuable lessons in the future. Thank you for watching.